So as promised, this video segment I will take you through some specific tips and ideas for how to read our course texts. So remember, the ones that we'll be working with every week are Chasteen, Born in Blood and Fire, and Wood and Alexander, Problems in Modern Latin American History. I'm not going to talk about the third book that is required for our class. This term it is Ay Rigoberta Menchú, because that might change in the future. That one changes more often than these two do in terms of how this class is structured. So there are separate tips and pointers and questions to be looking for in the Unit 6 activities for that particular book, and in the questions that are posed in the background given in the final project instructions for Ay Rigoberta Menchú. So please look to those resources for that one, and by the time we get to that point, hopefully a lot of the tips and pointers for reading these other two will apply and help you with Ay Rigoberta Menchú. Also, let me apologize for my dog. Mowgli's back there chewing on a bone, so such it is, I guess. Before you pick up either of the books that you need to read in each unit, you should first go and find the guiding question for that unit. So for Unit 2, you can find, well, for every unit, you can find the guiding question in the syllabus where the course schedule is. It's stated there. It's also stated at the beginning of every learning module in Brightspace. So for example, the guiding question for Unit 2 is, how did colonial era institutions and issues shape the process of Latin American independence? That's something, those are things you'll be reading about during the Unit 2 readings. You'll be looking for what were colonial era institutions, what were the issues that they raised, and what was their relationship to independence movements when they came in the early 1800s. So you should, again, kind of take apart that question and think about, what is it that I'm looking for as I complete the readings? I'm starting here with the Problems in Modern Latin American History book. You could start with Chasteen if you prefer, if you want to get kind of more of a contextual overview. I offer some kind of very brief context in the beginning of each learning module on Brightspace, so look for that as well. I also have posted videos to introduce each unit in which I talk about that guiding question and some of the big themes for the unit. All right, so for Unit 2 then, and again, this pattern will apply to every unit in our class, but for Unit 2, the assignment in Wood and Alexander is chapters 1 through 3. So I'm going to open the book. Just for the sake of showing, I'm going to look at what are chapters 1 through 3 about. Chapter 1, Legacies of Colonialism. So there's that question about the colonial era, or that part of the question, I should say. Chapter 2, Independence. Chapter 3, Slavery. Slavery was one of those colonial era institutions. And so that's kind of how I know I'll approach thinking about that chapter. So again, I have a general idea what these chapters are about. Next, I'm going to go to Chapter 1. I'm going to skip over the preface and things like that. So Chapter 1 begins here. I will start by reading word for word the introduction to the chapter. So this is the editors, Wood and Alexander, have written a couple of pages and given some questions for analysis to introduce the theme of colonialism. Once I've read through that, and I'll be taking notes, thinking about maybe highlighting, you can see I write in my books, highlighting ideas that help me answer the guiding question, then I will look at the titles of each of these documents. You could go back to the table of contents for that. I also recommend reading in italics. There's an introduction to each document. I'm calling them documents. Some of them are primary sources, some of them are secondary sources. So you need to pay attention to what those are. So this one is Camilla Townsend. She's a historian writing about worlds colliding in Tenochtitlan. This comes, so I can look at the footnote here, from her book Malintzon's Choices. So again, I know this is a scholar writing about a woman in colonial Mexico, the colonial experience. I can also, if I didn't know that, because I know that as the history instructor here, you can read the introduction in italics to get a sense of what it's about. So I recommend reading the titles, reading through the introductions, if not word for word, at least getting a sense of what each of these is about. right? So the next one is Chris Lane, another historian writing about Indian labor in Quito, in what is today Ecuador. You know, so I can look through, get a sense of just the general idea of what he's talking about by having read that introduction. Do the same thing with Stuart Schwartz about Quilombo of Palmares. I don't know what a Quilombo is, but I'll find that out by reading this introduction. Those are all secondary sources so far, but now we have a priest reporting on social conditions in Mexico, Manuel Abad y Quiepo. So this is a primary source. You can read again this footnote to see which historian has excerpted and translated it. So that's not coming to us in its original form for sure, because it's published in this book. But those are some things to kind of look for. Still flipping through. Matthew Restall is a historian. So here's another secondary source. This chapter is heavy on the secondary sources, and it's probably because the colonial era is not really the focus of this book. Instead, the modern era is. So they're trying to just give us the big ideas, the themes that historians have been thinking about. Visual source, Ordering the Colonized Space. You can read the heading there to learn more about this colonial era map image of Santo Domingo in what is today the Dominican Republic. So once I've read through all of that, I'm going to go on and read the introduction to chapter 2 and essentially do the same thing. So notice I haven't read any documents word for word yet. I'm going to go through chapter 2. I'm going to read the editor's introduction, look at what their questions are, take some notes, and then I'm going to go through and see what kinds of sources are being presented with. This is a constitution from Spain, so this is a primary source. This is the words of Simón Bolívar, leader of independence in South America, maybe the leader of independence, according to some historians, so a primary source. This is about Father Morelos in Mexico, but it's written by Enrique Krause, who is a thinker and writer in Mexico. So this is a secondary source, his evaluation of Father Morelos, who was a figure of the Mexican independence movement. What Independence Meant for Women, Sarah Chambers, another historian. Again, I'm going through this quickly, but I get those cues and understanding by reading these italicized introductions and by looking at the footnote of where this thing came from. So again, go through. Here is a primary source, Tropical Agriculture from Andres Bello. Kirsten, I should say, Schultz, writing about Tropical Versailles. This is a historian, secondary source. And that's where chapter 2 on independence ends. And so I got to think about, what did I learn about independence from this? Which documents might I want to read in more detail in order to answer the guiding question for the unit? I'm going to do the same thing with chapter 3, reading this introduction, underlining words, taking notes, and then looking through all the documents as I had done with the others. So again, as I look at the documents, whether they're secondary, primary, and I'm thinking about my interests and the questions that are coming to my mind as I read, that's going to be your cue to decide, okay, I'm going to read, I do want to read John Thornton's piece on Africans in the American world in detail. So I'm going to go back to that after going through this overview of all of these chapters. I'm going to read this one in detail to see what he is saying about Africans coming to the American world, not just the United States, but the entire hemisphere, including Latin America. Or I could have decided I would really more like to get the testimony of an actual enslaved person. So I'm going to read the account of Esteban Montejo here in more detail. So again, what I'm saying is you don't have to read everything word for word. And this is a good way of getting a general sense of what these chapters are about. I've assigned you kind of these broad sections of the books each week so that you can find your own way to answering the guiding question, so that you can kind of make your own path through our survey of Latin American history that will help you to best understand it. So now that I've talked about the Wood and Alexander book, I'm going to give you another video segment on Chasteen.